Before the frost comes. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over English villages in October, not the lazy silence of summer, nor the sealed-up hush of winter, but something in between, a waiting. The leaves have given up pretending and gone to gold and rust and a bruised, reluctant red. The air smells of wet soil and something faintly sweet, the last gasp of the apple season, and if you are the sort of person who notices such things, you might feel, walking through a village like Hollowcroft on an evening in that month, that the world is holding its breath. Miss Jane Marple was precisely the sort of person who noticed such things. She had arrived on the 4:15 from London 3 days prior, her small overnight case carried by young Derek Oakes from the station, who had the good manners to carry it without being asked, and the better manners not to comment on its weight. Constance Beale had been waiting at the gate of Wisteria Cottage, a little rounder than she had been at their last meeting, a little greyer, but with the same bright eyes, and the same way of squeezing one's hands that made you feel you had not been gone long at all. "Jane," she had said, "oh, Jane, it is so good," and that had been quite sufficient. Hollowcroft was, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly ordinary village. It had a church, St. Edmund's, with a tower that leaned almost imperceptibly to the left. It had a post office that also served as a general shop. It had a pub called the Hare and Horseshoe, where the bitter was warm, and the landlord, a Mr. Potts, was of the opinion that the world had been going to ruin since approximately 1953. It had a village hall, a cricket pitch, a war memorial, and the usual assortment of people going about their usual assortment of business. What it also had, and what gave it its only real claim to distinction, was the Ashgrove estate. The manor itself was a handsome old thing that had been allowed to become slightly less handsome over the decades, in the way that English country houses often are. The windows needing repainting, the south wall draped in untended ivy, the gravel drive grown thin and apologetic. But the orchard was something else entirely. 40-odd trees, some of them planted in the 17th century, heavy with the last of the autumn fruit. You could smell it from the lane. On still evenings it was almost overwhelming, something between sweetness and rot, the perfume of things ending. Miss Marple had walked past the orchard wall on her second afternoon in Hollowcroft, and she had paused there, her hand resting on the old stone, looking up at the branches that overhung the path. A thrush was somewhere nearby, doing something complicated. A single apple had fallen into the lane and lay there in the mud, quite perfect, quite alone. She had looked at it for rather a long time. Then she had walked on and thought about other things, and gone to bed early, and in the morning the world had changed. Part 1. The Body in the Orchard. It was Albert Finch who found her. Albert was the gardener, or had been the gardener for Ashgrove Manor for the better part of 20 years, under the previous owner, old Mr. Ashgrove himself, who had died the previous spring. Under the new owner, Mr. Edmund Farley, Albert had been kept on provisionally, which was the word Farley had used, and which Albert had understood to mean that he was there until he was not. He had come to the orchard at 7:30 that morning because there was a section of the east wall that needed pointing, and he preferred to get the heavy work done before the light changed. The mist was still thick between the trees sitting in the low places, and the grass was soaked through. He had his barrow with him, and his tools, and he was thinking about nothing in particular except the wall, and whether it would rain, when he saw the shape at the base of the oldest tree. He thought at first it was a sack. Someone had left a large brown sack against the roots of the old bramley, which was the tree that stood at the very centre of the orchard, the one that had been there since before anyone could remember. Then he saw the hand. He did not run, because Albert was not a man who ran. He walked quickly to the edge of the orchard, and then he stood for a moment with his hand pressed flat against the bark of a young cox's orange pippin, and he breathed. Then he went to fetch the constable. Constable Hedges arrived at 8:20, and Detective Sergeant Truman from Dorchester followed at 9:15, and by 10 o'clock the orchard had a small official presence and a considerably larger unofficial one, in the form of various residents of Hollowcroft, who had found excellent reasons to be in the lane beside the orchard wall. The dead woman was Iris Melton, 53 years old, of Laburnum Terrace, Hollowcroft. She had worked as housekeeper at Ashgrove Manor for 7 years, first under old Mr. Ashgrove and then, briefly, under Edmund Farley, until 3 weeks ago, when she had been dismissed. The stated reason, as reported by Mrs. Potts at the post office, to anyone who would stand still long enough, had been a difference of opinion about household management. The actual reason, as Miss Marple would eventually come to understand, was considerably more significant. She had been struck on the head once with something blunt and heavy that had not been found. The blow would have been quick. She had not, the doctor said, suffered. Whether this was meant as comfort or simply as medical information was not entirely clear. But the thing that Miss Marple heard about, from Constance over breakfast, who had heard it from Albert Finch's wife, who had heard it from Albert himself, was not the blow or the absence of a weapon or any of the usual grim furniture of such discoveries. It was the apple, a single green apple placed on Iris Melton's chest just below the hollow of her throat, not fallen, placed, deliberately, carefully, with what must have been a certain peculiar tenderness. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Placed, she said quietly, not fallen. That's what Albert said. Constance looked uncomfortable. The police think it blew down or rolled or... In October, said Miss Marple, the windfalls are brown and soft. They don't roll neatly onto a person's chest, and the green apples are still on the tree, she paused. Someone put it there. Constance stared at her. But why on earth would anyone... That, said Miss Marple, reaching for her knitting, is precisely the question. Part 2. The new owner of Ashgrove. Edmund Farley had arrived in Hollowcroft in late August, when the summer was still pretending it would never end. He had come in a large silver car driven by a man who did not speak, and who was gone the same afternoon, and he had stood in front of Ashgrove Manor with his hands in his pockets, and looked at it the way you look at something you have bought, and are deciding whether you are pleased with. He was, by Hollowcroft's reckoning, somewhere in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the specific way of London men who have spent money on their clothes but not much time thinking about them. Hair gone to silver at the temples, a face that would have been pleasant 20 years ago, and was now merely careful. He had introduced himself to the village in a minimal fashion, a brief appearance at the pub, a handshake for the vicar, a nod for the post office, and then retreated behind the orchard wall with his telephone and his London habits. He had been, Constance told Miss Marple, not unfriendly exactly, more absent, as though Hollowcroft were a backdrop he had engaged rather than a place he had come to. The solicitor's office was in Dorchester. Farley, it was known, ran a legal practice there, a small firm specialising in property conveyancing and estate law. He had, according to local gossip, which in Hollowcroft was more reliable than the 6 o'clock news, purchased Ashgrove Manor through his own firm, handling both sides of the transaction, which was the sort of thing that was not, strictly speaking, irregular, but was the sort of thing that made people raise their eyebrows and say, well. He was not popular with the remaining staff. Tom Griggs, who had been groundskeeper at Ashgrove for 31 years and had an opinion about everything from pruning schedules to the proper temperature for mashing potatoes, had been dismissed within a fortnight of Farley's arrival. He had not gone quietly. He had gone, according to Mrs. Potts, with language, and he had been seen since then walking past the orchard wall in the evenings with the deliberate, slow tread of a man doing his best not to kick something. And then there was Iris. Iris Melton had stayed on after old Mr. Ashgrove's death out of loyalty, and out of a sense that the house needed someone who knew where things were. She had, by all accounts, been efficient, honest, and possessed of a memory for detail that had served the manor well. Farley had kept her, at first, and then, 3 weeks ago, he had not. Miss Marple took a quiet walk past the manor the morning after the discovery. The orchard wall was still cordoned with police tape on the far side, orange bright against the old grey stone. From the lane, she could see the windows of the manor, and in one of them, the study, she thought, on the ground floor, she could see Edmund Farley standing at the glass looking out. He was looking at the orchard, not at the police tape or the small cluster of constables or the official vehicles parked on the verge, at the orchard itself, at the trees. His expression, from a distance, was difficult to read, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that Miss Marple, who was a considerable student of shoulders, found interesting. He did not look like a guilty man exactly. He looked like a man who was very carefully deciding how to look. There was also, she noticed, and this she filed away carefully beside the apple and the freshly turned earth she had spotted near the old Bramley's roots, a large consignment of concrete supplies, bags of aggregate, sand, a cement mixer on hire standing just inside the manor gates. The order had been placed, according to Constance, who had it from the delivery driver. on the same morning that Iris Melton had been dismissed. Not after her death, before it. The renovation, Farley had told the constable when asked, was purely cosmetic. He was laying a path through the orchard, improving drainage, modernising. Miss Marple thought of the freshly dug earth beneath the apple tree. She thought of a path that would, if laid according to the plans Farley had apparently shown the constable, run directly over that exact spot. She said nothing about this for now. She was not, after all, official. She was simply an old woman visiting a friend in the country, knitting by windows and walking in lanes and noticing things. She was very good at noticing things. Part 3. Nora Tilney and the matter of the will Iris Melton had, as far as anyone in Hollowcroft knew, one living relative. Her niece, Nora Tilney, who was 28 and who worked at the estate agents in Dorchester and who came to visit her aunt on the occasional Sunday, arriving on the 10:30 bus and departing on the 4:15. Nora was the sort of young woman who was described, in the particular vocabulary of English village life, as a bit much. She was not a bit much in any dramatic fashion. She did not make scenes or dress outrageously or say genuinely shocking things. She was a bit much in the specific way of young people who have formed strong opinions about everything and have not yet learned the social wisdom of keeping some of those opinions to themselves. She spoke quickly, stood very straight, and had a way of looking at people when they said something she disagreed with that suggested she was doing them a courtesy by not saying what she thought. She had, Constance said, been seen arguing with Iris outside the Hare and Horseshoe, on the evening before Iris was found dead. Not shouting, nothing so undignified, but low and fierce and purposeful, in the way that arguments are when they concern money. Miss Marple made a point of meeting her. It was not difficult to arrange. Nora had come to Hollowcroft the morning after the body was found, white-faced and very still, to speak with the police, and to begin the grim administrative work that death creates. She was sitting in the post office tea room when Miss Marple came in for a pot of Earl Grey, and Miss Marple, who had a gift for appearing harmlessly accidental in her appearances, simply sat at the adjacent table and allowed the conversation to happen. It happened, as these things do when grief is fresh, and the silence too large, and unnaturally and quickly. She was difficult, Nora said at one point, wrapping both hands around her tea. I want you to understand that. She could be. She had opinions about things, about how things should be done, about loyalty. Many people of her generation do, said Miss Marple warmly. It was, I think, something that was taught rather than chosen. One was loyal to the place one served, the family, the house. Nora looked at her sharply and then, deciding something, nodded. She knew things about that house, about what Farley was doing. She'd been going through the estate papers, the old papers from Mr. Ashgrove's time, and she'd found something. She wouldn't tell me what exactly, but she was frightened, I think, though she would never have admitted it. Was this what you were arguing about? The night before? I wanted her to go to the police. She refused. Nora's jaw tightened. She said it wasn't her place, that she would handle it herself, that she... God. She pressed her lips together. I told her she was being a fool. She told me I didn't understand what loyalty meant, and then the bus came and I got on it, and that was the last time I... She stopped. Miss Marple did not fill the silence immediately. Silences she had found were often more revealing than any question. After a moment, Nora said more quietly, She'd changed her will, you know, last month. She'd had it amended. Something about the contents of the house. There were specific papers, documents, that she wanted handled by a solicitor she'd chosen herself. Not Farley's firm, someone independent. Do you know which solicitor? A Mr. Henley in Shaftesbury. She mentioned him once. I didn't think much of it at the time. A pause. She was protecting something. Or someone. Even at the end she was protecting something. Miss Marple stirred her tea and said nothing. But she was thinking about Iris Melton, a woman who had known the difference between fallen apples and placed ones, who had spent 7 years in that house, who had held her tongue and then finally chosen not to, and about what it cost, that choosing. She was thinking too about the will, about a woman who amended it, specifically, precisely, and was dead 3 weeks later. Timing, in Miss Marple's experience, was never accidental. Part 4. The Reverend's Accounts. St. Edmund's Church of Hollowcroft was the sort of church that had been improving itself incrementally for 700 years and was still not quite finished. The tower leaned. The heating was inadequate. The kneelers had been embroidered by the Women's Institute in 1978 and were beginning to look it. But the churchyard was beautifully kept, because the Reverend Gerald Ashby kept it himself on Tuesday and Friday mornings with a persistence that his parishioners found both admirable and slightly alarming. He was in the churchyard when Miss Marple found him, on the Friday morning, crouched over a grave with a small pair of shears, trimming the grass at the base of a headstone with the focused attention of a man who finds peace in precise work. He was perhaps 60, with a long, good-natured face that was presently wearing an expression of mild preoccupation. He looked up when she spoke, and his expression shifted very briefly, or into something else, a flash of something she might have called wariness, before settling back into pleasantness. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Constance's friend from London, or rather from St. Mary Mead," she supplied. "Rather a small place. You wouldn't know it." "A terrible business," he said, meaning Iris. "A truly terrible business. She was—" He paused. "She served old Mr. Ashgrove very faithfully, for many years. You knew her well. She worked here before Ashgrove Manor, you know, long ago, when she was young, as housekeeper for my predecessor, Reverend Tomkins." He was trimming carefully, not looking at her. She was a young woman then, very capable, very thorough. Something about the slight weight he placed on that word, thorough, stayed with Miss Marple. "The parish must feel her loss deeply," she said. "Yes." Then, after a small silence, she contributed to the Restoration Fund generously for several years. Miss Marple waited. He glanced up. "You're wondering about the parish accounts." It was not quite a question. "I'm wondering about nothing in particular," she said, which was entirely untrue. He sat back on his heels, the shears resting across his knee. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the headstone in front of him. Then he said carefully, "I made an error of judgment some years ago, a financial matter. Nothing, I want to be clear, nothing dishonest. But an error that could have been misunderstood. Iris knew about it. She had found certain documents in the rectory. I had been her employer, briefly, as I say, and there were papers from that period in the rectory records. And she had used this knowledge. She had never—" He stopped, then revised. "She had never asked for anything directly. She was not that sort of woman, but I was aware that she knew. And recently," he paused again, "she came to me, last month. She said she was going to be speaking to a solicitor. She said she wanted to make sure that any documents pertaining to Ashgrove Manor that she had in her possession would be properly handled. She didn't threaten me. She simply told me. In that way she had." "And the parish fund withdrawal?" Miss Marple asked very gently. He looked at her directly for the first time. "That was returned," he said, "in full 10 years ago." The error was corrected. "Then you have nothing to fear from any solicitor reviewing those papers?" "No." He seemed to deflate slightly. "No, I don't. But the announcement that she was going to a solicitor at all, I panicked. Foolishly. I withdrew what I needed to replace what had once been missing should anyone look. But there was nothing to look at. It was all very, thoroughly, nothing." He paused. "She was protecting herself," he said, "with knowledge. She'd spent a lifetime doing it, working in houses, knowing things about people. It was her security. And then one day she found something that went beyond her own small securities, and she—" He stopped. "Poor woman." Miss Marple agreed. She thanked him for the conversation, admired the churchyard, and walked back down the yew-lined path, thinking about people who keep secrets as insurance, and what happens when the thing they are insuring against becomes larger than they anticipated. Part 5. Tom Griggs and the Old Orchard. Tom Griggs lived in a cottage on the west edge of the village that had once been part of the Ashgrove estate and had been sold off, along with several other parcels, when old Mr. Ashgrove began to feel the weight of the upkeep. Tom had bought it at a favourable price, in recognition of his years of service, and he kept it with the obsessive tidiness of a man who no longer has a large garden to manage, and directs all that energy into what small patch of ground remains to him. He was 66, with hands that had the look of tools rather than appendages, and a face that had been outdoors in all weathers for 4 decades. He was as Constance had forewarned Miss Marple direct. "They want me to think I did it," he said, by way of opening when Miss Marple knocked and he answered. He seemed entirely unsurprised by her presence, which suggested either that Hollowcroft's information network had been functioning or that Tom Griggs had decided to be unsurprisable on principle. "On account of I had a grievance. Well, I had a grievance. Farley had no right to let me go. 31 years I tended that land." "The orchard, particularly, I imagine," said Miss Marple. Something shifted in his expression. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He made tea, wordlessly, and they sat together at his kitchen table with the window looking out over his small, perfect garden. And he said, "The old Bramley at the centre, you know about it?" "I know it is very old." "Planted in 1703, according to Mr. Ashgrove Senior, the original grant deed for the land, the one that established the estate, was buried in a tin box beneath the roots when the tree was planted. It's an old custom. Land grants kept in the earth, literally, physically, so they couldn't be taken away, so the proof of ownership was in the ground." Miss Marple was very still. "Iris told me," he said, 6 months ago before all this, when Farley first showed up with his surveys and his renovation talk. She'd found the references in old Mr. Ashgrove's private journals, which nobody but her had read, because nobody else had bothered. There was a box under that tree, the original land grant for Ashgrove Estate, signed, dated, legal. "And the significance of that being," said Miss Marple slowly, "that if the original grant differed from the documents used to complete the sale, then the sale's wrong," said Tom flatly. "The boundary, the parcel, something. Iris didn't know exactly, but she knew it was in there, and she knew Farley had used documents from his own firm to complete the conveyancing, and she knew nobody had checked the original grant, because nobody knew it existed, except her, and then me, and then—" He stopped. She was going to get it out herself. The tin. She'd been digging, carefully so as not to damage the roots. I told her not to do it alone. I told her to wait. He looked at his hands. "I should have gone with her." Miss Marple looked at the man across the table, a man who had spent 31 years knowing every tree in that orchard, who had been dismissed and dispossessed, and was now sitting in a small kitchen that smelled of damp soil and old tea, carrying the knowledge of exactly what had been done, and to whom, and unable to prove it. "Did Iris tell anyone else? About the tin, specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "She was careful with it. But Iris, she was the sort of woman who prepared, who covered herself. I think she might have told that solicitor, Henley in Shaftesbury." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I think she might have done." Part 6. What Miss Marple remembered. It was raining that evening, a thin, purposeful autumn rain that found its way through every gap in Constance's ancient cottage and drummed steadily on the kitchen windowsill. Constance had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache that Miss Marple suspected was more exhaustion than pain. The cottage was quiet except for the rain and the settling sounds old houses make in the dark, like a person turning in sleep. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting. She was making a cardigan for her niece in Suffolk in a soft blue wool, and she thought. She thought about a woman in St. Mary Mead 20 years ago. Mrs. Alice Pryor, who had rented the house at the end of Gossip Lane, and whose husband had been cheating her of her income from the tobacconists, and who had taken to leaving dried lavender on the front step each morning. Not lavender from her own garden, which was remarkable, and not left randomly, but placed, always in the same spot, always a specific amount. Miss Marple had eventually worked out after weeks of watching that the lavender was a signal to her sister, who passed the house each morning on her way to work, telling her whether the shop's accounts had been properly balanced that week. A signal left in a place. Meaningful to the recipient, meaningless to everyone else. She thought about the green apple on Iris Melton's chest. Iris had been killed at night. The doctor had estimated between 10 o'clock and midnight. She had come to the orchard, alone, in the dark, which meant she had gone there deliberately. The ground beneath the old Bramley had already been partially excavated. Iris had been digging for the tin box over several nights. But on this last night someone had been there before her, or had followed her, and that someone had struck her and left her, and then, having left her, had gone back and placed an apple on her chest. Why go back? You have committed murder. Your instinct is to leave, to put distance between yourself and the thing you have done. You do not return to add a decorative element. You do not unless the apple is not decorative, unless it is a message. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily. She thought about who would receive such a message, about who would pass that orchard, see the body, see the apple, and understand. Not the police. The police would think it accidental or meaningless. Someone specific. Someone who knew what a placed apple at the foot of that tree would mean. A co-conspirator, she thought. Not a partner in murder. She did not think the murder had been planned, not precisely. But someone who knew about the tin box. Someone who was implicated in what was inside it. The apple was a signal. I have handled it. Do not speak. Do not go near that tree. It is done. She set down her knitting and reached for her cup of cocoa, which had gone cold. The question was, who, besides Edmund Farley, had known about the documents? Who had been close enough to the original transaction, the sale of Ashgrove Manor, to have something to lose if the original land grant surfaced? She thought about the Reverend's careful choice of words, about Nora's too specific knowledge of the will's amendments, about Tom Griggs. I think she might have told someone. She thought about Edmund Farley's property conveyancing firm, a small firm, and about the fact that conveyancing, even fraudulent conveyancing, requires signatures, witnesses, someone to hold a pen on the other side, a second person. She put down her cup, picked up her knitting again, and began to count stitches. The fire popped. The rain continued. Outside, in the dark, the orchard was wet and silent and full of secrets. Tomorrow she thought she would call on Edmund Farley. Part 7. A Call at Ashgrove Manor. She went in the morning, under the reasonable pretext of inquiring about the history of the orchard for a watercolour she claimed to be composing. She had brought a small sketchbook, to lend the fiction of physical reality. And Farley received her in the hallway with the cautious courtesy of a man who is not sure what he is being cautious about. He was taller than she had expected from the window, handsome in a used sort of way. He had the easy confidence of a man who had spent his professional life talking to people who needed things from him, and the eyes of someone who was, beneath that ease, permanently calculating. "Miss Marple," he said. "Constance Beale's friend. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I know it must be a dreadful time with the—" She gestured vaguely, suggesting everything. "Terrible business," he said, as people do when they need to fill space. "Please come in." She was given tea in the drawing-room, which was still in the half-settled state of a house being arranged by someone who hasn't fully decided what they want it to look like. There were good pieces of furniture and some indifferent ones. There were packing boxes against one wall. There was on the mantelpiece a framed photograph of Edmund Farley with another man, both in suits, both smiling at something off camera, at what looked like a property development event. The other man was younger, thick-set, with a watch that caught the light. "Your partner?" Miss Marple asked, nodding at the photograph. "Associate," Farley said, slightly too quickly. "Jonathan Reeve. He handles the commercial side of the practice." "How useful to have someone who complements your skills." "Quite." She talked about the orchard, and he answered in the polite minimal way of someone who has decided to answer politely and minimally. He said the renovation was planned to improve drainage. He said the old layout was impractical. He said he had no particular attachment to the existing arrangement. "Old Mr. Ashgrove, of course, was very attached to it," Miss Marple said serenely. "I understand he kept personal papers at the estate, documents pertaining to the original land grant." There was a pause. Very brief, the length of a heartbeat. "I believe there were various documents in the study," Farley said. "Most were reviewed as part of the conveyancing process. Of course, though I understand some of the older records were quite buried, historically speaking, not in any accessible filing system. Historical records of that kind are often fragmentary." "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "that's true, although I understand that an original land grant properly constituted and witnessed remains legally significant regardless of its age. One of those delightful quirks of English property law. The ground, as it were, remembers." Farley was looking at her with a different quality of attention now. "Do you practice law, Miss Marple?" "Good heavens, no," she said, and laughed her small, harmless laugh. "I'm a very old woman who asks far too many questions. It's an occupational hazard of village life, I'm afraid. Everyone's affairs become rather interconnected." He smiled. It did not quite reach the calculating eyes. She finished her tea and left, and as she walked down the gravel drive she heard, behind her, the sound of a telephone being picked up. It was not conclusive. People made phone calls, but there was an urgency to the sound of it, the particular urgency of someone making a call they have been waiting to make. Miss Marple walked home through the orchard lane, and she thought very carefully. And that evening she telephoned a man she knew in London who worked in property law and asked him one specific question about land grants and conveyancing irregularities and what happened when original documents came to light. The answer confirmed what she had suspected. She slept rather well after that. Part 8. The weight of what was buried. There is a kind of fraud that is not complicated exactly, but requires a specific confidence in two things: that the original evidence no longer exists and that no one will go looking. Edmund Farley had been fairly confident of both. The estate of Ashgrove Manor had passed on old Mr. Ashgrove's death to his only surviving distant relative, a great-nephew in Australia who had never visited England and had no interest in doing so. The great-nephew wanted the money. He had signed what was put in front of him via the solicitor engaged to handle the estate, and that solicitor had been Edmund Farley's own firm. The fraud, and it was fraud, of the clean and technical kind, lay in the boundary. The land grant of 1703 established the orchard and the meadow beyond it as integral to the estate, legally indivisible from the manor. A later document, one prepared by Farley's firm, purportedly a mid-20th century boundary adjustment, quietly removed the meadow from the parcel. This reduced the land area, and thus the sale price, by enough to matter. The meadow had been quietly sold, 2 months after the manor, to a development consortium with which Farley's associate Jonathan Reeve was connected. A tidy piece of work if the original 1703 document never came to light. Iris Melton had found the reference to it in the private journals of old Mr. Ashgrove, meticulous, careful journals kept in a leather case in the library, which Farley had apparently not bothered to read. The journals mentioned the tin box beneath the Bramley. They mentioned its contents, and Iris, here who had spent 7 years in that house and knew every corner of it, had understood immediately what it meant. She had gone to Farley first. That was Iris, loyal to a fault, even to people who had not earned the loyalty. She'd given him the opportunity to correct it, to deal honestly. He had dismissed her. Then she'd gone to the solicitor in Shaftesbury, and she had begun digging, literally, for the proof. The detail that most moved Miss Marple when she had assembled all of this in her mind was that Iris had told Tom Griggs. Not for protection, not as a safeguard, but because Tom loved that orchard and deserved to know that someone was trying to do right by it. It was a human thing to do, a warm, impractical, very human thing, and it was the same warmth that had gotten her killed, because she had not been secretive enough. She had been seen, on those evening digs, by someone who reported back to Farley, or perhaps Farley had simply watched. He had, after all, a perfect view of the orchard from the study window. The apple still puzzled her slightly. It was the one piece that felt personal rather than practical. The murder itself was a brutal practicality, a problem solved. But the apple was something else. It was, she thought, the gesture of a man who needed to mark what he had done. Not from guilt, but from a kind of dreadful pride. He had done something difficult and he had placed a marker on it. That, to Miss Marple, was the most revealing detail of all. Villains, in her experience, fell broadly into two categories: those who wanted to be invisible and those who, in some corner of themselves, wanted to be known. Farley was the second kind. He was theatrical. He could not resist the gesture. And that, she thought, folding her hands in her lap in the quiet of the cottage sitting-room, was exactly what she would use. Part 9. The gathering at Wisteria Cottage. Constance was a wonderful hostess when she put her mind to it, and she put her mind to it that Saturday afternoon, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has lived quietly for a long time and finds in any domestic occasion the opportunity for something like joy. She made scones, she made a Victoria sponge, she arranged the sitting-room with an eye to comfort and laid a fire against the October chill. She did not entirely understand why Miss Marple had suggested inviting Edmund Farley to tea, along with Nora Tilney, the Reverend Ashby, and Tom Griggs. She had been too polite to ask directly. Instead, she had said, "That's a rather mixed group, Jane." And Miss Marple had said, "Yes, isn't it?" in a tone that did not invite further inquiry. They came, each for their own reasons. Tom because Miss Marple had gone round to his cottage and said, quietly, that she thought she knew what had happened to Iris and would like his presence. Nora because grief will take any open door, any possibility of action or understanding. The Reverend because he felt the peculiar obligation of clergymen to be present when things are being gathered together. And Farley because Miss Marple had telephoned his study that morning and said, very warmly, that she had so enjoyed their conversation and was hosting a small gathering of the people who had known dear Iris as a sort of informal remembrance, and she did hope he would come. He had come. He sat in the good chair by the window with his legs crossed and his tea balanced on his knee, and he looked at the room with those assessing eyes, and he was, to all appearances, simply a rather elegant man attending an awkward social occasion with reasonable grace. Miss Marple sat near the fire with her knitting and made no sign that anything in particular was intended. She talked, first, about old Mr. Ashgrove, about what a careful man he had been, how thorough, how much of the village history he had kept alive simply by writing things down. He had such faith in documents, she said. He believed, I think, that if something was written down and kept safe, it could never entirely be lost. Even if years went by, even if people forgot, the record would persist. She paused, needles moving. I understand, she continued, that the County Property Records Office in Dorchester has been receiving various inquiries recently, relating to the Ashgrove estate. She said this in a tone of perfect innocence, as if reporting the weather. About the original land grant specifically. Rather interesting, I thought. These things do surface eventually. Silence. She looked around the room, pleasantly. Nora was watching her intently. Tom Griggs was perfectly still, his cup held in both hands. The Reverend was looking at the fire. Edmund Farley uncrossed his legs. The County Records Office, he said. His voice was controlled. May I ask, which office, and what specifically was being requested? There it was. Miss Marple looked at him with mild, pleasant surprise. Do you know, I'm not sure of the details. Do you know of some particular record that would be relevant? Mr. Farley? The room was very quiet. The fire made a small sound. Farley understood, a fraction too late, exactly what he had done. His eyes moved across the room, to Tom, who was looking at him steadily, to Nora, who had gone rather white, to the Reverend, who was studying his tea, and then back to Miss Marple, who was knitting with an expression of entire serenity. Which deeds? He said quietly. Not a question any longer. That, said Miss Marple, is rather the point, isn't it? Part 10. What the Ground Remembered. Detective Sergeant Truman received a telephone call that Saturday evening from Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, who described herself with characteristic accuracy as a rather interfering old woman with a good deal of relevant information. He had, in his career, received several such calls from unexpected sources, and his instinct, formed by experience, was to listen first and dismiss nothing. He was glad he had listened. The excavation of the ground beneath the old Bramley tree was completed by Sunday afternoon, with appropriate forensic supervision. The tin box was exactly where Tom Griggs had said it would be, 3 feet down, to the east of the primary root system, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved it remarkably well. Inside, a land grant, dated 14th March 1703, establishing the bounds of the Ashgrove estate with a specificity that 2 centuries of weather could not diminish. The meadow was named. Its boundaries were clear. It was, unambiguously, part of the estate. The document Farley's firm had used to conveyance the estate, a supposed boundary adjustment dated 1962 and bearing the signature of a council officer who had, it emerged, been dead since 1987, was, when set beside the original, obviously fraudulent. Not crudely so. It had been done with the particular skill of someone who understands exactly how much scrutiny such documents receive, and how to stay just within that margin. But the original grant made the fraud impossible to sustain. Jonathan Reeve, Farley's associate, was interviewed in London on Monday morning. He was, it appeared, a man who had been waiting for a knock on the door for some time, and had spent the intervening years not quite believing it would come. He cooperated fully, in the way that people cooperate fully when the alternative has become too heavy to carry. The meadow sale was reversed. The development consortium folded within the week. Farley was arrested on Tuesday. He said very little. In the way of people who know that saying very little is the last card available to them. His lawyer, not from his own firm, which had ceased to exist in any practical sense, was a large, unhappy man from London who spent 3 days saying no comment on his client's behalf with the resigned expertise of someone who has said it many times before. The question of Iris Melton, of her death specifically, was harder in the legal sense, because murder requires proof of a chain that is always partly invisible. But the phone records helped, and a pair of boots found in the manor's garden shed, with clay soil consistent with the orchard, helped more. And Reeve, who had not been in Hollowcroft that night and had nothing to gain by silence on this particular point. I had provided a conversation that he and Farley had had by phone at 11:45 on the night in question, in which Farley had said something that he had tried to forget and had been unable to. It was enough. Miss Marple, when Constance asked her how she had known it was Farley specifically, and how she had known the apple was a signal, and how she had known about the box, said that she hadn't known really. She had simply noticed. She had noticed that the apple was placed, and that placement implies intention, and that intention requires a reason, and that the only reason to place a signal at a murdered woman's side is if someone is watching who will understand it. And then it was simply a matter of who had something to protect and what the orchard meant to them, and what was buried in the ground. "The ground," she said, almost to herself. "What?" said Constance. "He believed the documents would stay buried," said Miss Marple. "He thought the ground would keep his secret. But the English countryside is very old and very patient, and it does not, in my experience, keep secrets that were put into it dishonestly. It gives them back. Eventually." Constance considered this. "That's rather poetic, Jane." "Yes," said Miss Marple, picking up her knitting. "I thought so too." Epilogue. After the frost November came to Hollowcroft on a Wednesday, with the decisiveness of a door closing. The last of the leaves came down. The sky became that particular English grey, which is not quite cloud and not quite emptiness, but something between. A colour for which there is no good name. The orchard, stripped and quiet, had a dignity it had lacked in the frantic abundance of autumn. The old Bramley stood at its centre exactly as it had stood for 300 years, the earth around its roots properly restored, the wound in the ground healed over with clay and autumn mulch. Tom Griggs had done the restoration himself. He had come to do it on the morning after the excavation without being asked, and he had worked all day, and when he was done the ground was as smooth and undisturbed as it had ever been. He had stood beside it for a moment after, with his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the bare branches, and then he had nodded once and walked home. He had been offered, by the solicitors handling the estate's legal complications, the position of head groundskeeper under the new management. Ashgrove Manor's ownership was in the process of reverting, in a procedure of considerable legal complexity, to the Australian great-nephew, who was now, having understood what he had nearly lost, considerably more interested in England than he had been. Tom had accepted on the condition that the meadow be restored to the orchard's care, and that nobody build any paths through the apple trees. Both conditions were agreed to without hesitation. Nora Tilney drove up from Dorchester on the first Sunday in November. She went to the orchard, she had been given access, and she stood beneath the old Bramley for a long time. She brought no flowers. She was not the kind of person who brought flowers. She brought instead a copy of the original land grant document, which the solicitor in Shaftesbury had arranged to have properly preserved and framed, and she propped it against the roots of the tree for a while, and she talked to her aunt, or to the tree, or to the ground, or to no one in particular. When she left, her eyes were dry. She was, Miss Marple thought, watching from the lane, the kind of woman who weeps later, in private thoroughly, and does not make a spectacle of grief. Rather like Iris, perhaps. The Reverend Ashby preached a sermon that November Sunday that Constance described as unexpectedly moving, about the difference between burial and preservation, and about what we put in the ground and what we expect to find there. He did not explain what had prompted the subject. He did not need to. Hollowcroft was a village that understood context. Miss Marple left on the Thursday of that week on the 11:07 with her small case and her knitting bag, and Constance holding both her hands at the station gate. "You'll come again," Constance said. It was not quite a question. "Of course." Miss Marple looked at her friend's familiar face, the bright eyes, the grey hair, the same warmth it had always had. "Perhaps in the spring, when the blossom comes out. It's very beautiful. The orchard in blossom. I thought it might be. She patted Constance's hands, both of them once. I'd been thinking about it since that very first evening, when I smelled the apples in the lane. The train was prompt. She found a window seat and settled her case in the rack and her bag on her lap. And as the train pulled out of Hollowcroft Station, she watched the village diminish in the window. The church tower, the pub sign, the lane, the old stone wall of the orchard, until it was gone. She thought briefly of Iris Melton, of a woman who had known the difference between what was placed and what had simply fallen, and who had spent her life preserving things, houses, records, the small dignities of service, and who had, in the end, been preserved herself, by the ground she had been trying to open. There was something right about that. Not comfortable, not fair in any simple way, but right, in the deeper sense of things returning to where they belong. Miss Marple opened her knitting and found her place in the pattern. Outside, the English countryside moved past in its November colours, grey and brown and the last stubborn gold of a few late-turning oaks. Quiet, enduring, full of things that had been put in the ground by people long dead, and were, in their own time, slowly, patiently, returning to the light.